here's a question that may seem a bit silly. Could this image, and the others like it, be considered in some sense historically accurate? Well, no, of course not. There are giant robots prancing about in a field in what can only appear to be the First World War. Well, you see, these are concept art pieces for two games. One's a board game called Scythe, and the other one is a video game called Iron Harvest. They're both sort of alt history, as much as I absolutely hate those two words when they're put together, but in any case, World War I, 1920s sort of setting games in which, you know, these giant machines were used in the First World War, and now, immediately afterwards, there's like three factions. It's like the West and Poland and Russia, and they're all fighting or some such. In any case, that's not all that important. That's the basic setting in which these artwork pieces are put forward. They're concept art to promote the games. I've never played them, but I'm absolutely fascinated by these pieces. Now, of course, nothing about them at all is historically redeeming. Not only is it, you know, blatantly admitted, well, yeah, of course, this is a silly alternate history type thing, in World War I, or immediately after World War I, but we're going to talk about it as if it's World War I. They're giant robots. Even the soldier, you know, even the people within the images, if we were to examine them and ignore the fact that there's a giant robot just behind them, or in front of them in this case, I'm sure we could just look at what they're wearing and it would still be horribly historically inaccurate because of all, you know, the helmet and everything with the spike. Oh, they would have covered those up in World War I. All sorts of things that we can complain about. So why this video? Why am I bothering to point out to you this complete work of fantasy and fiction? It's actually not real! Hey, big surprise! There's something more to it than that. I think, you know, I'm absolutely fascinated by these pictures. I love watching them, and I think that might be because there is actually something that is historically accurate about them, something historically correct, and while it may not be the actual content of the images, I think that we may look at this and see that the sentiment proposed within them is very much real. The ideas, the feelings that we have elicited from these images are, I think, a very striking way to get into the heart of what some people would have gone through in the First World War. Now, allow me to explain myself here. When you look at these pictures, what feelings are elicited in you? They're feelings of, at least as far as I'm concerned, the feelings that are elicited in me. You may look at this and you know, think it's funny or something such, but I look at these pictures and I think, you know, they impose a feeling of dread, of awe, of terror even, as we see these often lone figures, very lightly armed, going up against, you know, massive, multi-story tall beasts, you know, mechanical monstrosities, the like of which we can't even imagine constructing in our modern day. And that's, of course, partially because they would actually collapse under their own weight if they were actually built, but, you know, that's beside the point. These things look terrifying, even to our modern eyes, let alone to what is, comparatively speaking, of course, a primitive society, such as like in, you know, in this case, the 1920s or say the 1910s in the First World War. Take those feelings of terror, of awe at viewing these massive technological monstrosities, or in this case, you know, diesel, punk, fantasy, magical, whatever they are, monstrosities. Technologically for them, we'll say. Within that universe, they are technological monstrosities. For us, of course, it's pure fantasy. And I think it is that feeling, those feelings of awe, which more accurately capture possibly the true sense that some men must have had in the First World War than what we can ever possibly to put forward or imagine today. You see, when we look at images of aeroplanes or tanks from the First World War, of machine guns or large battleships, and of millions of men, you know, mobilized all at once, we look at that and we can think to ourselves, wow, that must have been pretty scary for them back in the day when they hadn't seen anything like that before. It was a new kind of warfare. Must have been very intimidating, but we have airplanes, we have tanks, we have machine guns, we have technological, you know, advances in warfare far beyond these sorts of things, and so we're always viewing these developments from our modern lens. We look at the images of tanks in the First World War, and we think, oh yeah, that must have been pretty scary for them. But, of course, We always have to keep in mind as well the massive, shall we say, faults in their systems. We always imagine their breaking down in the field, the fact that they were so horribly slow and inefficient, the fact that they were constantly, smoking out their own insides based on the, exhaust fumes sort of being funneled back into the system. We always see the reality of the systems, so to say, rather than the impressions which men would have received of them. By way of example, imagine, if you will, that you are a poor peasant farmer, be it in Britain, France, Germany, Austria, wherever you want to be, really. I don't see any why you'd ever pick Austria, Germany, or France, of course, but that's beside the point. You're a poor peasant farmer. Your entire life has consisted more or less of the, say, 20 miles, give or take, immediately surrounding your own home. You've gone into town a few times, of course. You have to go to market to purchase some produce there, or to sell things. You buy tools or mend things. All the sorts of. You occasionally go into town, but for the most part, your life is spent on this farm, bringing in the harvest every single year. The same thing, year in, year out. Of course, your father, he fought in South Africa. He fought the Boer, and he has very grim memories from that place. He doesn't talk about it too much, but he has occasionally told you war stories of the heroism of the brave English boys down in South Africa. Your grandfather perhaps also has war experiences, fighting the Zulu or something, I don't know. Your uncle was in the Sudan, and all these. Your entire family and the culture around you is all being raised, and you're growing up on the legends, worshipping at the altar of men like Gordon, like Kitchener, like if you're in France, then Marchand, in Germany, any one of the number of German staff officers who kind of showed it to the French in the 70s. You're growing up at the altar of these great military heroes and the whole, the adventure, so to say, of life beyond your own little square, your own little corner of the empire. Suddenly, one year, life on your farm is disturbed. War has broken out across the seas. Fighting in the continent between Germany, France, Russia, Britain, all of the world, it seems, at least all of the world that really matters, has begun, except the United States, of course, but they always come in late. All of the world has begun to engage themselves in a great conflict, the likes of which you have never before seen. The stories are nothing compared to what you've seen here before. And now the time has finally come for you to go out and make your own chapter in the family history, and to make your own mark in the world, and to see what the world is like outside of your little, farmstead. Of course, perhaps as of right now, you're still a bit young, and your family still needs you at the farm. You're not yet able, for whatever reason it may be, to go and enlist, and so you have to wait a few years. But say it's around 1916, 1917, and finally your opportunity to go and enlist into the forces, or perhaps you were conscripted, your time is coming. For whatever reason, you go over to the recruiting office and you sign that piece of paper. You are now enlisted into the army, or, whatever force it may be. You were rapidly given a uniform, a crisp, nice, fancy uniform, the nicest clothing that you've ever seen in your entire life. You're given a steel hat, which makes you feel like some sort of medieval knight going off into the continent to fight the French, like in the 100 Years' War or something, with this great big kettle helmet you're wearing. You're given a rifle, the likes of which, high-powered and sophisticated. You've always fired, little fowling pieces back home, going hunting and whatnot, but never have you before seen anything of this sort of scale, of this caliber. It's fitted with a grim bayonet, and you are trained to use this equipment to shoot and fire at not animals but men. You are trained to become a killer, effectively. After some short period of training, of course, you are sent into a city, and you see, of course, I won't go into too many details about seeing the wonderment of the city, because that's a trope that's been, tried and tired out by now, but these buildings, the amount of people, the things everywhere, it's a scale that you've never before seen of humanity. And that is, of course, to say nothing of when you get on board the first transport ship. Of course, you've seen steam engines, you've seen railroads and everything, you've seen steamships before, but even still, you've never been on a ship like this before. The entire thing rumbles and shakes from the engine down below the decks. It spews black smoke, and there are men milling about everywhere you go. Again, more people than you've probably ever seen in your entire life. And all of you are going over to fight the Hun, or the French, or the English, or whoever you want to be today. And as you're crossing over the channel, or what have you, you see on the horizon ships even, 10, 15 times bigger, it seems, 1,000 times larger, it seems, than the one that you're on currently. Massive warships spewing out the same black smoke with massive guns on their decks, the likes of which it seems as though they could destroy the entire world, the scale of which you have never before seen. You thought your piddly little SMLE was impressive, take a look at the 15-inch guns over there. Wow, I'm really getting carried away with this, aren't I? So we'll skip ahead for a bit, after all of these amazing... You may be able to see where I'm going with this sort of thing. You've seen already on your journey to the front, you haven't even seen the enemy yet, and already you've been blown away by the size of these naval vessels, the sheer masses of humanity. And finally we have the culmination of all of these weeks or months, what have you, of experience, of these new and exciting new experiences, as you finally arrive at the front. Now, I won't go into too many details about, the smashing of the illusion, so to say, of the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria more, Latin for you. We've covered here on this channel before the true terror of the First World War, the stench of the bodies lingering in the air, and the barbed wire, and the death everywhere. That's all been covered before, by other people as well as by myself. I won't go into details on that sort of thing, but continuing with the theme or the idea of the sense of awe that an individual must have had in, going into this sort of war. You see, as you are approaching your trench, gun emplacements, massive batteries of artillery, larger than you ever would have imagined. Not only is each individual field piece, absolutely massive, far larger than the things that your, parents or grandparents ever described to you taking place in, Africa in the 1890s or some such. And not only that, but there are thousands and thousands, fields endlessly of these pieces, and they're always firing, there's always some sort of a dull thrumming in the air of the artillery pieces, lobbing shells halfway across the world, it seems. Always in the distance, sometimes even closer, just sort of omnipresent. In fact, these batteries, keep in mind, were so plentiful, so massive, so loud, that they could even hear them in England across the channel, at least during some of the larger engagements, such as the Battle of the Somme, where, over 1 million shells were fired in the course of, a very short amount of time. You see all of these things. You see men manning, machine gun nests and sniper rifles and all these even, bigger and more impressive pieces of military equipment than your own rifle, which just a few months ago you were so impressed by. You see, effectively, the massive effort of a military operation all coming together in one place. And perhaps most awe-inspiring of all, more impressive than the battleships with guns larger than your home, than the artillery batteries, that stretch for miles, it would appear. More impressive than all of these things would be that when you look up into the sky, what do you see but aeroplanes, flying machines made of wood and metal, darting back and forth, firing at each other, shooting each other, dropping bombs into your trench, and sort of an untouchable layer of the world suddenly grasped and used by mankind for a militant purpose. How awe-inspiring it must have been to look up in the sky and see weapons of war. And of course, next to all of these developments, there is still one more innovation within the First World War, which I think above all of the others would have left, by far the most lasting and awe-inspiring and terrifying impression on the men who first went against them. Imagine now, we're going to be rather specific with this one, that you are a German soldier, 1916, a conscript. The war's been waging now for quite some time, and you've already been, blown away and sort of deadened. Your senses become deadened now to all of these new and spectacular things that you've seen. It's sort of a regular occurrence now to hear the guns constantly thudding away and the ground exploding all around you. You've become used to hearing the shrieks of pain and terror as men become trapped in barbed wire around you. You've become used to all of these terrors. So we'll say that one of these days you're sitting in your trench or in a bunker somewhere or, in an occupied home or what have you. You're waiting for the English assault and suddenly you hear something that you've never heard before. It sounds almost like the noises, almost like the mill that you'd always pass by on your way to the market back in town. It sounds sort of like a factory of some sort. A sort of grinding of metal, like a bunch of steel plates being clacked against each other, and slowly growing louder as something is approaching you. You then hear the sputtering and the growling of an engine of some sort. You very distinctly hear the spluttering of smoke through an engine. An engine? What could that be? There's no airfield anywhere nearby. There's no trucks hauling any sort of artillery pieces that you should be aware of in the middle of no man's land. So you look off, out into the distance of no man's land, and what do you see? A sort of metal box that's slowly trudging its way across the field. It's propelling itself, it's dragging itself through these massive fields of mud with massive tracks along its side. You see that they're sort of sloped at the front, and you see the thing dipping into and out of shell holes as if they were nothing. Jutting out of either side are sort of sponson type things with guns sticking out of them, and just behind this massive monstrosity, this mechanical beast, you see an entire company or platoon or, what have you, of riflemen, crouching and moving behind it as if underneath the protection of some massive, mechanical beast that was protecting its young. It's getting closer and closer. You're stunned at first. You're rather blown away, but eventually the command is given, Feuer frei, or, whatever the German would be. And, there's some sort of, they're advancing. The British are advancing against you. And so you begin firing against this thing, this metal monstrosity that's approaching, and your bullets are just bouncing off of it. It's just pure metal. It's like a pillbox or a bunker that's moving against you. The sides of this machine start bristling with activity as machine guns and howitzers begin firing against you. There's artillery pieces inside this metal box that's being dragged across the field against you. Imagine that. The terror, the awe of going against or even, following along behind these mechanical monstrosities, these tanks for the first time. It must have been an absolutely incredible experience, to put it in a rather fond light. To help get those feelings across, I'd like to share just a few quotes with you detailing some of the men's first experiences and impressions of these machines. This first account comes from a German war correspondent and his first experience with these technological terrors. He writes, "My blood froze in my veins. Crawling along the cratered battlefield were two mysterious monsters. The monsters approached slowly, limping, staggering, swaying, but no obstacle could stop them. They moved ever forward with a supernatural force. Our machine gun fire and hand grenades simply bounced off them, and they were thus able to easily destroy our crews in the forward shell holes, and then run straight through the German front line and off into the village of Flers, where they stayed for some time. The British infantry which had followed them took possession of the village, and the machines drove off down the Ligny-Tilloy road." Alongside this mysterious portrayal of the tanks by the Germans as something of, almost animalistic in sense, he describes it limping across the field and then disappearing into the night. We have an account by a British soldier, certain Bert Cheney, who was a 19-year-old signals officer who saw the tanks in use from the other side, though in an equally grim fashion. He describes them as such. "We heard strange throbbing noises, and lumbering slowly towards us came three huge mechanical monsters, such as we had never seen before. My first impression was that they looked ready to topple on their noses, but their tails and two little wheels at the back held them down and kept them level. Big metal things they were, with two sets of caterpillar wheels that went right round the body. There was a huge bulge on each side, with a door in the bulging part, and machine guns on swivels poked out from either side. The engine, a petrol engine of massive proportions, occupied practically all of the inside space.
Mounted behind each door was a motorcycle type of saddle, seat, and there was just about enough room left for the belts of ammunition and the drivers. I was attached to battalion headquarters, and the colonel, adjutant, sergeant major, and myself, with 4 signalers, had come up to the front line. From this position, the colonel could see his men leave the assembly trench, move forward with the tanks, jump over us, and advance to the enemy trenches. As a new style of attack, he thought it would be one of the highlights of the war. While it was still dark, we heard the steady drone of heavy engines, and by the time the sun had risen, the tanks were approaching our front line, dead on time. The Germans must have heard them too, and although they had no idea what to expect, they promptly laid down a heavy curtain of fire on our front line. This had the effect of making us keep our heads down, but every now and again we felt compelled to pop up and look back to see how the tanks were progressing. It was most heartening to watch their advance, and we were almost ready to cheer, but there was a surprise in store for us. Instead of going on to the German lines, the 3 tanks assigned to us straddled our front line, stopped, and then opened up a murderous machine gun fire, enfilading us left and right. There they sat, squat, monstrous things, noses stuck up in the air, crushing the sides of our trench out of shape with their machine guns swiveling around and firing like mad. Everyone dived for cover except the colonel. He jumped up on top of the parapet, shouting at the top of his voice, "Runner, runner! Go tell those tanks to stop firing at once I say!" By now the enemy fire had risen to a crescendo, but giving no thought to his personal safety, as he saw the tanks firing on his own men, he ran forward and furiously rained blows with his cane on the side of one of the tanks in an endeavor to attract their attention. Although, with the sounds of the engines and the firing in such an enclosed space, no one in the tank could hear him, they finally realized they were on the wrong trench and moved on, frightening the Jerrys out of their wits and making them scuttle like frightened rabbits. In addition to all of this, there is one further quote from a British war correspondent about one of the numerous ways in which the Germans attempted to deal with these new, technological monstrosities. He writes of the Germans, "Their courage was extraordinary. Despite being under fire from the vehicle's machine guns, they tried in desperate fury to storm the mobile armored fort and kill its crew. They lifted each other up, climbed on board, searched its hatches and portholes, and fired their weapons into the slots." And so, with that, it would appear that, while most immediately terrifying to them, the Germans may well have gotten over this initial fear rather rapidly. However, they would have realized as well that they had no real way to deal with these absolute monsters. And I think that may well be one very interesting point, that alongside being described as, effectively mobile fortifications, the language oftentimes used to describe these vehicles, at least at first, are oftentimes animalistic in nature. We've seen it described as beasts and as hulking monsters and whatnot. So, with that being said, back to me.
So after all of that storytelling, all of those digressions, let's finally return to this picture. Can it be historically accurate? Well, of course, the actual picture, no, it can't be. But imagine, going back to the genuine feelings of awe and terror that must have, been inspired in these men, going up against the height of mechanized warfare for the first time in their lives. I think in order to truly capture the genuine feelings that those men were experiencing, we cannot simply read the accounts or look at pictures of what they would be going against, because we know in our modern period, we have experiences of airplanes, of tanks, of machine guns. We can at least in some minor way relate to these experiences in a way that a man going against it for the first time would not have been able to experience it. And it's by looking at pictures like this where we can see something that we, our condition as we are these days, have absolutely no real experience of, that we can genuinely capture those feelings, at least as closely as we possibly can. And so, in a very real and terrifying sense, yes, indeed, this image can be considered historically accurate. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.